So now the Guru, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, is calling on the gods and other sentient beings to come here to listen to the Dharma, which is like a nectar to the ears, and which actually eliminates or dispels all negativities from one's mind. And the Guru says, assurance and so forth. So this is a hom. So His Holiness is enough with call that oboe. So this Mönlam festival, which is held every year, is one of the great legacies of the great Master Tsongkhapa, who lived in the 14th, 15th century. So of course there were times when the times were very bad. So we have not been able to hold this Mönlam festival, the prayer festival. And in 1959, after the Mönlam festival in Lhasa, then we fled. And then for some time, maybe we had not been able to hold the Mönlam festival, this prayer festival. But after coming into exile, we revived it. And this is to remind ourselves of the great deeds of the Buddha when he was in India, when at one point in his life he was actually competing in miracles with non-Buddhist teachers at that time. So to remind ourselves of the Buddha's deeds, we during the Mönlam festival, there's this tradition of reading the Jataka Tales. And Jataka Tales is one of the 6 texts of the Kadam tradition, founded by Dromtempa. And then other texts are the Udana Varga, or Tibetan version of Dhammapada, and then Bodhisattva Bhumi and Sutra Alamkara by Asanga and Maitreya. And then, so these 2 texts by Asanga and Maitreya actually cover the extensive Bodhisattva paths. And then we have the other two texts, remaining two texts by Shandideva, Shiksha Samuchaya, or Compendium of Practices, and the engaging in the Bodhisattva deeds, Bodhisattva Charya Avatara. So which deal also with extensively about the Bodhisattva practices, and particularly the Madhyamaka view from the So with regard to the Jataka tale, it gives us an inspiration to follow in the footsteps of the Buddha, who, by learning from the Jataka tales that the Buddha actually went through so many different practices. I mean, practiced the Bodhisattva practices while he was training on the path to enlightenment. So today we have people from different parts of the world here, varieties of people. So usually I do introduction to Buddhism before giving the actual teaching of Buddhism itself. So I consider this important. Why? Because all of us Buddhists think that we are Buddhists, and therefore we do our prayers and our virtuous practices and reciting mantras and so forth. But what is Buddhism? And what is the difference between Buddhism and non-Buddhist traditions? We are not so, we don't know much about these. So with regard to the teaching of the Buddha, in order to have a faith based on reason, in Tibet in the past, Buddhism spreads the length and breadth of Tibet. And so, although this was the case, but we had so many people in the general public who remained the illiterate. And so we took for granted the teaching of the Buddha without really understanding it. And so general understanding and knowledge of Buddhism amongst the general public was very poor. And then we took it for granted that the teaching of the Buddha is something which we need to take on faith alone. That's not the case. We did some prayers and also recited mantras. So whether these practices, recitation of mantras and prayers, would really become virtuous practices or not depends on our motivation. Although apparently they might seem to be virtuous practices, physical and verbal practices, but then this could become non-virtuous if you had bad motivation. So, in order for the practice of Buddhism, the Buddhist teaching, to become a Buddhist practice, mere faith alone will be quite difficult. It would be difficult to make that practice into Buddhist practice as such, without understanding. So what we need to have is this motivation or the intention or the wish to become enlightened. And with that motivation, with that understanding and knowledge, then if you do your practices, for example, if you do your practice of recitation of mantras and prayers and so forth, imbued with this sense of wishing to be free from the samsara, then it would become Buddhist practice. We also do recite and read different Mahayana scriptures. But in order for our practices of reading and these scripture and also reciting the great dharanis and mantras, for them to become Mahayana practice as such, we need to have the altruistic motivation. And therefore, what makes difference in our practice of Buddhism is our motivation. So it's very rare for to have, we can see, in the past, of course, there were very few people who really understood what Buddhism is about. But today, we are in the 21st century, and therefore, people are taking interest in gaining knowledge in general. Education is considered very important. So, of course, when you study Buddhism, for example, we need to be skeptical. We need to have doubt. Doubts actually happen. But with regard to the Buddhism, we need to do investigation, analysis, and use reason and logic. So, based on that, based on logic and investigation, then we should generate faith, and that in turn should induce us, in us, the wish to become free from samsara, and also the wish to become enlightened, fully enlightened, for the benefit of all sentient beings. So, in the old days, good old days, as we may say, of course, the society was not yet much developed, but the times have changed. And therefore, I give introduction to the teaching of the Buddha, not merely by resorting to scriptural quotations, but through reason, to make people understand whether Buddha's teaching is something which can be actually verified through reason or not. And therefore, Buddha himself has said, "O monks and scholars, just as a gold is tested by rubbing, cutting, and burning, likewise you should examine my teaching and then accept it, not because you have reverence to me." So whether you're a practitioner of Buddhism or you're a scholar, you should not just base yourself on faith, saying that, oh, such and such should be believed because it was taught by the Buddha. So Buddha has said that this should not be done. Just because it's the word of the Buddha, we should not take it for granted that what is said is true. So the Buddha has said, just as the quality of a gold should be tested by melting, cutting, and rubbing, just as a goldsmith does this, likewise, you should examine and investigate my teaching, whether there is any logical fallacies or contradictions in the teachings or not, whether the teaching can be undermined by reason and logic or not. Then if you find that they cannot be undermined through reason, that they are logical and reasonable, then you should accept it. So of course there have been many founding teachers of the different religious traditions. And for everywhere in the East and West, we have great teachings from these founders who teach that people should be good, kind, compassionate, loving, and tolerant, and so forth. But none of these teachers other than the Buddha, has said that their followers should actually examine their teaching. And when they see reason, when they see the teachings to be based on reason and logic and logical, then they should follow it. So none of them has taught. And so in the past, we had the tradition of praying to the 6 or 8 different Indian masters. And on top of that, I added 9 and made 17. So I have written this praise to the 17 Nalanda masters who actually examined the teaching of the Buddha and investigated into it, the teachings, and wrote their texts and based on reason. Except in certain cases where they only were actually addressing the Buddhists. Sometimes when they wrote certain texts, most of these teachers actually wrote treatises based on the reason. So, for example, in Pramanavartika by Dharmakirti, he actually analyzes the teaching of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, through reason and not resorting to mere quotations. With regard to Vinaya, the monastic discipline, text on monastic discipline, it's a different case, of course. The rest of the texts always are deal with the subject matter through reason. And when we study the Prajnaparamita, for example, there are the mention of the followers, 2 types of followers. One who is of more brighter intellect, and the other duller intellect. So the duller ones follow on faith, and the former follow on based on reason. So they are called so the term for the beings of brighter intellect are called Wangnen, and they follow Chu. And Chu doesn't here mean the Dharma or religion, but it means reason. And therefore, these types of people actually test the teaching of the Buddha, investigates into the teachings, and then they see what benefits the teaching has, and then they experiment these teachings, and whether it's beneficial or not. And therefore, these masters have written texts through 3 different points. One is actually rejecting others' positions, and then establishing one's own position, and then rebuttal of others' criticism to one's position. And so they refute others' assertions first by saying that, not by saying that, oh, what you have said is not the teaching of the Buddha, but with reason they investigate into the teaching of other traditions, and in this way they refute their assertions. And then when the other party says, oh, then in that, of course you are rejecting or refuting my position, my assertion, but what is your position? Do you have any position? And therefore, these masters actually establish their own position and assertion as well. And in this way, they actually go through critical analysis of the teaching of, and when they find that even some teachings of the Buddha are not supported by reason, then they actually do not accept. For example, in the case of sutra called the revealing the intention of the intention, or Samdhi Nimochana Sutra, it is a sutra which was taught by the Buddha. And for example, in the Chinese tradition, they follow this kind of sutra. But if you only focus on one text, like this particular sutra, then you will not be able to have a wider perspective of the teaching of the Buddha. So with regard to what is taught in it, with regards and also the philosophical view, you'll find that when you actually put these teachings contained in this text to the test of reasoning, you'll find logical fallacies and in certain assertions of the number of consciousness and so forth. And therefore, Master Chandrakirti has said such a teaching, such sutras should actually be regarded as provisional and not definitive teaching. But such teachings like this one, Sandhinamochana Sutra and others, should not be taken literally. Because when you actually put these teachings to the test of reasoning and investigate into to verify what is taught in them, then there will be logical fallacies, and therefore one should not take them as literally. And so, with regard to the teaching of the Buddha in general, and particularly the Nalanda tradition, it has spread to China, and from there to other countries like Japan, Korea, Vietnam. And so they follow the Nalanda tradition. In other words, they follow they are familiar with Nagarjuna, the name. And then in Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Laos, they follow the Pali tradition mainly. Of course, they have the three Pitaka, the three baskets of the teaching of the Buddha. So all the teachings of the Buddha contained in the Sutra and Tantra come under these three collections of teachings called the three baskets, the three Pitaka. So with regard to Vinaya, the monastic discipline, code of monastic discipline teachings, they are similar. What the Theravada Pali tradition has and what we have are similar. There are a few minor differences with regard to the minor aspects of the monks' precepts, but the rest are all basically they are the same. And then with regard to the practice of concentration, also it's the same. And then with regard to the training of wisdom, there are maybe a few differences with regard to it between the Pali and Sanskrit tradition. And then in the Sanskrit tradition also, we talk also about the division of phenomena into conventional and ultimate realities or ultimate truths. So with regard to the teaching of the Buddha itself, as we have mentioned earlier, we can divide it into provisional and the definitive teachings. So I always claim and say that the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is in Nalanda tradition. So all the Buddhist traditions of Tibet, Sakya, Nyingma, Kagyu, Gelug, and so forth, and even today, even the Burn tradition follow the Nalanda tradition. So Nalanda tradition is the source of our Buddhist tradition of Tibet. Just as we would say that the source of the river is up in the mountains. And then, on the other hand, some people have even said that the Buddhism in Tibet is Lamaism and not a real and actual Buddhist teaching. But we can actually say that Tibetan Buddhism is a Nalanda tradition of Buddhism. So amongst in the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, the different traditions, Sakya, Nyingma, and so forth, and we study the classic texts written by the Nalanda masters, which are commentaries to the teaching of the Buddha. So it's not merely a word that we say we are a follower of Nalanda tradition. But what we do actually is we study all these great texts and treatises written by Nalanda masters, not just one single text and focusing on that, but we study the many different texts and then compare them and contrast different teachings, different traditions and philosophical views. So the Tibetan masters have written certain genre of texts called Dupta, or system of philosophical thoughts. And therefore, we study all these different philosophical thoughts of the different traditions. And therefore, we become very well versed in the different traditions, philosophical views, and not just remain in a narrow kind of focus. So in Tibetan Buddhism, we talk about the practice of doing the external practice of Vinaya, the monastic discipline, and internally we practice Mahayana and Bodhisattva precepts, ideals, and then and Bodhicitta, and then secretly Tantra. Now, what we must also understand with regard to Chö or Dharma is whether it is beneficial, whether it is something which is good for us, helpful for us or not. So if it's helpful, then we need to cultivate and practice it. If it's not helpful, then we should not. So Dharma or Chö, Dharma here in Sanskrit has the connotation of saving us. Saving from what? Saving from suffering. And so that has that connotation of actually holding us from the suffering. And then the Tibetan term for Dharma is Chö, which means a corrective measure. So what that means is making transformation within ourselves. So now think about the Dharma. So all of us are sentient beings. We are human beings first, and we have our mind, and because of this mind, we also have experiences of pain and pleasure and so forth. So in the case of plants, for example, they do not have that kind of sentiency that we have, feeling or experience as such, but they, of course, they go through the process of growing and dying and so forth. And then with regard to the weather, we see lots of changes in the weather. It may be good in the morning, and by evening it will be bad. And it may be bad in the morning, and by evening it will be good, and so forth. So these are changes that are happening in the external world. So all sentient beings have the same experience of pain and pleasure. But the difference is that the insects and birds and so forth mainly use the five senses, the sensory perceptions, eye, ear, nose, ear, tongue, and bodily sensations, and not much beyond these perceptions. And when they feel hungry, they actually seek food and drink, or when they are when they feel some danger, they would hide somewhere. They would try to find a place to hide, and so forth. But they are not really able to use the sixth faculty, the mind. Of course, there is some use of the mind, because the mind also is related to our five senses. And so in that respect, they do use, but not like us humans. And so with regard to the world systems, in the Buddhist texts, there is mention of the number of world systems as numerous as the number of grains of sand in the Ganges River. And today, cosmology also describes that there are billions of galaxies as well. But beings living in these galaxies or the different world systems do not want suffering and want happiness. And particularly with regard to humans, on this earth, we are 7 billion or so. So we as humans have a very active brain. So neuroscientists today say that we as humans are not able to use our brain fully, the potential of our brain fully. So this human brain has a very special, it has a great potential. So of course animals do not have the same kind of ability to use this brain, their brain, like us, to check and examine into the realities of things. So by doing investigation, critical analysis into what things actually are and so forth, then we know a whole lot about the other things and ourselves. But while we use this brain so much, sometimes we are not sure whether we are actually using it for constructive purpose or destructive purpose. We can see this in the world today. There are people who are very knowledgeable, educated, well-educated, and so forth, but they remain unhappy. When all kinds of thoughts processes are going on in their minds, in order to calm their minds, people use drugs, sleeping pills, and so forth. So these actually add more to our suffering, to their suffering, and instead of really bringing real happiness. So when the animals do not have any immediate danger to their life, they actually remain calm and relaxed. But we as humans, because of our brain, this marvelous brain, while we actually physically may be relaxed, but then in our mind, all sorts of thought processes go on, all kinds of preconceptions go on, and therefore we have lots of suffering from that as well, unlike the animals. So, of course, all of us do not want suffering, and therefore we need to use this brain, this marvelous brain that we have, to bring happiness for ourselves, not to cause more disturbance of mind. And so if we do that, then we would be foolish. And we would be ungrateful to ourselves. So we have this brain, this a special intellect. Don't sit there. Here. So, based on this, our critical faculty, this wisdom, mind, we should actually develop altruism, love, compassion, and so forth. So all of us do not want suffering. We want happiness. So this is what even scientists today say, not because they resort to some scripture. They do not actually resort to some other scientists' quotations. Of course, when the other scientists are really authoritative, they would follow their words. But generally, the scientists actually follow reason and investigation. So this compassion or affection is there, right, at the time of birth, because we survive through our parents' affection. If our mother, for example, hated us right at our birth, then we would not survive. If you look at the birds, for example, we can see the mother birds actually taking care of their babies with so much affection. And so, biologically, actually, we need to rely on others' affection for our survival. So, few weeks after birth, the scientists say that if our mothers actually held us close to their body, in their embrace, then it really, of course the child does not have any kind of understanding or perception that the other person is his or her mother, but this gesture actually helps in growing, in the enlargement and growth of the brain very much. So it's crucial. And therefore, right at birth, since our birth, since we need to survive through affection, we can also find that if a person is more affectionate, more loving towards others, then they are happier. So whether you believe in a religion or not does not matter, because most religions are based on faith, not Buddhism as such. So His Holiness is asking people to shift up to the front, because it's raining. So there are people who are outside. So if you actually sit closer together, it will be warmer for everybody. Maybe some people can go upstairs also. So if you have love and affection or compassion in your mind, then physically also will be healthy. But if you are full of fear, suspicion, anger, and so forth, and selfishness, then of course selfishness gives rise to fear, not love or compassion. So if you are full of anger, hatred, jealousy, and so forth, and fear as well, then it actually these actually deplete our immune system. It is said by the scientists. Push it. Hey. So even medical scientists say this, that our love, affection, and so forth actually help our health. It's good for our health, whereas anger and so forth are bad for our health, our immune system. So on the one hand, we have this wisdom. On the other hand, we also have this potential for love and compassion. So many people think that when we talk about love and compassion, it is only for others, and to help others, to think of others and not oneself as such. But as a human being, as long as we are human beings, we have this wisdom, this intellect. And in order to live happily, we need to have, by using this intellect, we need to develop compassion, which gives us happiness. So the first thing we have to know about ourselves, the first is on a human level. We are human beings. And even from the point of view of religion, we make prayers for all sentient beings. But whether we actually have direct contact with the other sentient beings or not, we have this connection with the other people on this earth. Even if you may be a single person, if you actually help one person, that is also beneficial. And while we may pray that may all sentient beings have happiness and do not have suffering, if you are not practical about it, even with one single person right in front of you, then it doesn't make sense. So we may not talk about such, but as human beings, we are a social animal, and so we depend on the society. And therefore, if we, with the help of our wisdom, if we could actually extend our help, this altruism towards others as possible, then that will help to develop, bring about peace in the world as well. So in the past, maybe people, because people lived in their own societies without having much each other, it may think about their own. Today, we are heavily interdependent, and therefore it is worthwhile to work for the benefit of the rest of humanity. And we can do that. And then we also, in our prayer, say that I call upon all sentient beings as my guests when we take Bodhisattva vow. So it is good to be honest, because if you lie to others, then others would lose their trust in you. When they lose their trust, you will have no friends. So if you want friends, be kind, loving, and you'll be happier, and then more relaxed and have more friends. Whereas if you are full of anger and also selfish motive, then you will not be happy. There will be no happiness in your mind, and also physically you'll have no fish. So if you really wish compassion and love, use your common sense also. So this you can understand this if you use your common sense. So if you, as a human being, you should be a kind person, an honest person, and then you'll have more friends, and then the society, the family will be happy, and then the society also will be happy. So from 7 billion or so people, 1 billion or so are non-believers, it is said. Think religion is only about faith, then sometimes there is a danger of losing faith. With blind faith, if you follow your religion, as Master Aryadeva has said, with regard to the person first, and then also be intelligent. If you are unbiased, if you are biased, then what you will say is, "Oh, my religion is better than the others." But if you are unbiased, you will not say that, but you remain skeptical, then you will do investigation. So today, we have lots of troubles being created around the world in the name of religion. This is because of biased faith. And therefore, it is important to be impartial. So even as a practitioner, we should remain impartial without having attachment to one's own tradition, and have actually developed more respect to others' religion and others' tradition. So with regard to this, having pure vision of others or respect, first, you can do it on the basis of religion or dharma, which means to save. So this aspect, religions have this aspect. One is religion, and then there is a philosophical aspect. Then also, thirdly, a cultural aspect of religion. So we can talk. We can actually have these three talk about religions with respect to these three aspects. So all the various religious traditions of the world teach love, compassion, tolerance, contentment, forgiveness. So I have many Christian friends and also Muslims and Hindus who are dedicated to work for others and are also dedicated to live a contented life themselves. So all these messages are same in all the religious traditions, but the difference lies in their philosophical aspect. Basically, there are two camps amongst the religions. One is those who accept a creator God, and then the other is the non-theistic group. So in the second group, in the first group we have most of the religions, and then in the second group we have the Sankhyas, one of the non-theistic Sankhya school, and also Jainism, who do not assert any kind of creator or creator God, and Buddhism. And then we have Zoroastrianism, which seems to have been one of the earliest religions in the Middle East or in the West. And then from then developed the Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so all these religions believe in a creator God. So although there are differences in terms of philosophy, asserting creator God or not asserting creator God, but based on causality, but all of them have the same message: love and compassion. So even in the case of the theistic religions, since they see ourselves as creature or creation of God, they see God as an infinite love. Therefore, they also are inspired to practice love and compassion. Whereas in the case of Buddhism, for example, the Buddha himself has said, "You are your own master," which means that what happens to you is in your hands. And it's also said that if you help others, if you then that as a result or consequence of that, you'll have happiness. If you harm others, the consequence will be suffering for you. And therefore, this is based on the law of causality. So there are different medicines, of course. Some medicines are sweet, some are bitter, and so forth. But all of them are meant for our health, to cure our sickness. And therefore, similarly, all the religious traditions are different, but then they are all meant for making a good human beings, for the practice to practice love and compassion and so forth. So sometimes even the Buddha has said that the grasping, self-grasping or ego grasping is some kind of a lineage of the Buddha to certain disciples. And so according to the mental dispositions of the different disciples, the Buddha gave different teachings. And so if we think that all these religions, the religious traditions are actually meant for making good people, then we can naturally develop respect for them as well. So it is very important to have religious harmony in the world. So this is something we, all of us as individuals can do. Whatever we can, I mean, whether it's small or big, we can actually contribute to it. So with regard to Buddhism, on the one hand, it does not, it rejects any creator God. And also, Buddhism rejects an independent self or soul, or a self which is separate from the psychophysical aggregates. So only Buddhism is the spiritual tradition which rejects an independent self. The rest of the religious traditions do assert it. And therefore, during his first sermon, first teaching, the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths. So when he taught these Four Noble Truths, he actually also went through the four attributes of each of these Four Noble Truths. With regard to the first Noble Truth of suffering, the four attributes are impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and selflessness. And then with regard to the four attributes of the origin of suffering, and so in other words, the Four Noble Truths serve as the big kind of a framework or foundation of the teaching of the Buddha. So the Buddha said we should know suffering. So what he meant by this is not merely the painful experiences that we know as being unwanted, because even animals are aware of it as unwanted. And therefore, what the Buddha meant when he said no suffering is the suffering which is the deeper suffering of the pervasive existential suffering. So in order to understand this, he taught that suffering is in the nature of impermanence. Because it comes through causes and conditions, it also ceases. So Bhashikas, one of the philosophical schools of Buddhism, says that things arise and abide and then disintegrate. And so this is from a very rough understanding of impermanence. So things come to an end because there is a cause which actually leads to that cessation. So if things were to be permanent, unchanging, then they won't disintegrate or cease in the end. Because things change momentarily, there is a cessation in the end. And therefore, here we are talking about the subtle impermanence, which is to say, momentarily changing. Things momentarily change. And therefore, the fact that things come into existence is because of their cause. And therefore, the changes that happen to us, our suffering and so forth, is because of the cause, which is our ignorance. So because of ignorance, we go through the changes within ourselves. This existence itself brought about by that cause. So within ignorance, of course, there's a mere not knowing something and conception of things. So here we are mainly referring to the later one. For example, when we think about ourselves, there is a notion of someone within us which is ruling over the body and the mind. So as if it's a separate entity that is within our selves. And when you hold that very dear to us, then what happens is you actually push others from yourself, saying, oh, they are others, not me. And then you also say, oh, such and such people are good to me, therefore they are my friends, my near and dear ones, whereas such and such people are actually harming me and causing me harm, therefore they are my enemies. And so you make that kind of distinction. If you are actually altruistic towards others, even enemies, of course, they do cause harm to you. But if you actually feel all sentient beings are same in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, then you'll also see the so-called enemies as your friends. You'll hold them also dear to you, because they also want happiness and not suffering. And with regard to the four attributes, because things change, and the change that is happened to us is through our cause, that is ignorance. We have suffering as well. And then Buddhism also teaches. Buddha also said the third attribute of this suffering, the noble truth of suffering, is emptiness. Here, emptiness refers to this lack of independent self, which is independent or from the psychophysical aggregates. Or we can refer to this as the rough understanding of selflessness. And then the fourth attribute is selflessness. So because our psychophysical aggregates, which is in the nature of suffering, is brought about by ignorance, what this ignorance holds on to is some kind of independent existence in things, objective independent existence in things, and therefore, since there is no such a self, there is selflessness. And then, with regard to the origin of suffering, it is said to be a cause. A cause here refers to the ignorance also. And then it is also said to be the source of all, because the cause itself has undergone change. It undergoes the effect it gives rise to also undergoes change. And then the third attribute of this second truth is rabgye, or thorough cause, arisal. So you can think about this in terms of the 12 links of dependent origination as well. And then the condition, the fourth attribute of the noble truth of origin is condition. This can be referred to the condition of craving. So, which in turn is rooted in our ignorance. And so, and then the Buddha goes through the four attributes of cessation, the truth of the true cessation. because ignorance perceives things otherwise, not in accord with reality, and the reality is that things are dependently originated, we can actually overcome this ignorance. Because of being misperception, when we develop the right understanding of how things exist, then we can actually eliminate it, and therefore there is cessation. And when we overcome all these negative emotions within ourselves, there's peace, and therefore the second attribute of cessation. And not merely because things have not arisen, but because the cause of suffering is eliminated by applying the counter force to in it. Therefore, we have the excellence when we reach cessation or liberation. So if the we should understand about mind is always there. Ignorance is not an intrinsic part of our mind as such. It doesn't remain all the time. And similarly, anger. If anger were to be an intrinsic part of our mind, then we would always remain angry, and that's not the case at all. And therefore, there are times when anger arises, and there are times when it subsides. And therefore, what we can see is the basic nature of mind is knowing, and therefore we can know the truth and reality of things and develop that understanding further and overcome ignorance. If a person is illiterate in the beginning, that person can learn the alphabet and then become literate as well. And so through our knowledge, we can actually attain cessation. And therefore, we can develop the path, which is the fourth noble truth. Because the path actually knows the reality and the truth of things, it is called the path. And then also awareness. And because this understanding and the experiences that you develop on the path must come through practice, it is called a practice. And it is that factor which leads to liberation as well. That's the fourth attribute of the path. And so the unique teaching of the Buddha is that of dependent origination, that things are dependently originated, and this is the philosophical view of Buddhism. And then the ethical practice is not harming others or non-violence. And so, in essence, the teaching of the Buddha has to be understood in terms of the practice of non-violence or not harming others, and the understanding of dependent origination. So there are many Amdo people who have come here listening to the teaching. His Holiness was asking if they really understood him. So if people ask you, what is Buddhism about? You should say that the essence of the teaching of the Buddha is the philosophical understanding of dependent origination and the ethical practice of non-violence or not harming others. So without really understanding how to develop peace within ourselves by overcoming the negative factors that actually cause disturbance in our mind, we, even if we may talk about peace in the world, it may not make much sense. So peace is actually disturbed by humans. But we all do not want suffering, but want happiness. But why still do we cause this? It's because of our disturbed mind. And therefore, in the teaching of the Buddha, what we find mentioned is that the Buddha is not against the beings as such, but their negative, destructive emotions. And therefore, we should see the negative emotions within sentient beings as our enemies, and the sentient beings themselves as our object of compassion. So a doctor, when he or she treats a patient who is totally disturbed, the doctor actually becomes more compassionate towards that patient, even if the patient might be quite rough towards the doctor. So people who actually cause so much disturbance and trouble, suffering to others, are seen as object of compassion. The Buddha feels compassion towards them and not anger. But the negative emotions of sentient beings are seen as enemies. So when someone is actually possessed by some evil spirit and so forth, the doctors, when they treat these people, they see the patient as not the enemy, but then object of compassion, and they treat the illness. So if we want to create peace in the world, we need to actually create peace of mind first. So when your mind is peaceful, then you'll have a peaceful family, peaceful individual, peaceful family, and then that can be extended towards others. The whole world, in the end, can be a world of full of love and compassion. And then there will be real, true peace in the world. And so the Buddhist practice of non-violence or not harming others is related to bold peace as well. And also the understanding of dependent origination is important. What that means is, so what does dependence and origination mean? And then when you have more a longer version of this term in Tibetan, we say originating through dependence and relation. And so in order to understand the deeper, to have a deeper understanding of what dependent origination means, we need to study. So therefore, education is very important. This is what we have been doing since we came into exile. In the beginning, of course, there were many monasteries, and many of them were merely focused on rituals. But what we actually focused on mainly was to establish schools for our children. And then after coming to exile, I also encouraged even the nunneries should study our classic texts that have been studied in the great monastic institutions of learning. So, as such, today we have nuns who are almost becoming nun geishas, female geishas. Therefore, we need. I also have been telling people that when people hear about monasteries, such and such monasteries, they should have this idea, get the impression that these places are places for studying the Dharma. Just as we have this impression of Nalanda monastic institution. So we have to create such an impression in the society that when people hear that there is such and such monastery or nunnery, they should get this impression that, oh, there is a place of learning there. And so those monasteries where they didn't have, traditionally, didn't have any study of classic texts, philosophical texts, they also have adopted this, the study of these classic texts. So I've been telling also people, Tibetans, that as followers of the Dharma, Buddhism, we need to become learned. We need to become also humble people, or and also good people. So we can become such because we have the teaching which teaches about the philosophical views and also altruism. So this is you should not think that you should become good people and so forth because the Buddha says so, but you should use your own intellect. Develop your understanding. For example, there was one Tibetan master, Nyangun Songrapa, who had said that in order to increase one's wisdom, of course, you can do a retreat or meditation on Manjushri for a month, but it would be much better to increase your wisdom by studying the collected topics, the very some kind of primer text for study of Buddhist logic and epistemology. And so he had even said that if you sit in a retreat or meditation on Manjushri for a month, it's not still certain that your wisdom will increase as such. But by studying collected topics for a month, you will definitely increase your wisdom. So, even with regard to the Tibetan language, we have a language which is really marvelous to understand the teaching of the Buddha. So Nalanda Buddhist tradition is something which actually can be propagated or explained to others through reason. And so we have this tradition which we can learn through our own language. And so there are many people in the West and other countries who also take interest in Tibetan. And so, of course, people are taking interest in paying attention to learning Buddhism and Tibetan, whether inside Tibet or outside of Tibet. And then, because of some opportunity to study the Buddha Dharma, there may be sometimes danger of people actually, because people are taking interest in the Dharma, the teaching of the Buddha, it's not impossible for some people in society to take advantage of others and indulge in inappropriate manners of going against the right living. So when I visited Mongolia in 1979, one of the programs that people in Mongolia had made was for me to visit a museum. So there was a painting of a monk with his mouth widely open, and then other people actually going inside, entering the mouth of the monk. So what that showed, or actually represented, was that the monks were actually abusing, oppressing, not oppressing, exploiting the common people. And the person who was actually showing me around in the museum felt a little bit embarrassed when we reached that painting. And I told him this is something, actually what it depicts is quite true. So the 13th Dalai Lama also visited Mongolia. So because there were so many people who wanted his blessing, and Mongolians were in two lines on the two had lined up on the two sides of the palanquin in which the 13th Dalai Lama was carried by the. And so on the two sides of the palanquin, they actually put two extra kind of things that actually could touch the heads of the devotees, because it was too much. It would have been too much for the 13th Dalai Lama himself to touch each and everyone's head. So we have to be careful. Actually come to us as claiming to be teachers. We may think I met someone from Tibet recently, or some time ago, who told me that there are people who actually claim to be Dharma teachers, but they actually, their intention was to make money and wealth. So of course these are possible. So we have to be therefore careful. And then, with regard to the Tibetan population, during the times of the Tibetan emperors, the religious emperors, there may have been many millions. And then during the time of Dromtönpa in the 10th, 11th centuries, he was said to have actually made a census of the population of Tibet, and it was said to have been 10 million at that time. And then today we say Tibetans are 6 million. One reason for that may have been because there are places in Tibet where I have seen the pictures in certain part of Tibet, like in the western part. I know some Westerner who is a researcher, and he actually had taken note of these places where there had been agriculture work in the past. These places have become abandoned later. So people may have died of sickness. And then the second reason of this decline in population may have been the number, due to the increase in the number of monks and nuns. So as a people, we need to actually give thought to this. For example, in India, of course, of course, India has this problem with population problem being too big. But as Tibet, we are very few in number. So of course we need monks and nuns, but we need more monks and nuns with better quality. So number is not important, but the quality is important. So this is something that I'm saying on the aside. And then there is a third cause for this decline in the population, which may have been because of Pauline takes two or three brothers as husbands. So to keep Buddhism, preserve Buddhism, it falls on each individual. So in the text we have mention of what kind of physical basis is needed for practicing the Dharma and attaining liberation. And so we need to increase our population. So if we have more Tibetans in our own land, it would be better for us also to take care of our work on our fields for agriculture and crops and so forth. Whereas the Chinese people have difficulty due to altitude to come. So Buddha actually can sit in single-pointed meditation while being able to see everything simultaneously. And so in the Heart Sutra, there is mention of a particular type of concentration that the Buddha was absorbed in, which is called the profound illumination. So profound illumination here could actually mean or refer to dependent origination. The profundity here refers to the dependent origination, and illumination could refer to the conventionalities of things. And so it seems to refer to both the truths. And then in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, there's mention of everything being mere name. So these Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, such as the 8,000 lines or verses of Perfection of Wisdom, 25,000 verses of Perfection of Wisdom, and so forth, mention this. And also goes through the different, while teaching explicitly emptiness, it also goes, they also go through the different progression along the path, the extensive bodhisattva paths. So when we recite the Heart Sutra and say that this is what we must understand, that we should understand both the truths. And then when we come to the point of also saying that form is empty, emptiness is form, so form or physical thing is something which is very rough that we can perceive. We should understand what is meant by these phrases or sentences. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form, and form too is not other than emptiness. So they show the two truths. That the two truths are not distinct or separate from each other as such, but they have the same nature while being distinct in conceptually. So, of course, things do exist, but when you actually search for them within them, you cannot find anything. But while they cannot be found, when we search for them, we can still experience their effect. So, the Madhyamakas say that, of course, things cannot be found when we search for them, investigate into the entity. It's not like the Chittamatras say, who say that the things do not have any external existence, but it's the mind or expression of the mind. But the Madhyamakas say that things, although things do not have any objective existence, but they do exist externally, although there is no objective existence as such. And therefore, we can talk about the two truths being in the same object. A form, for example, is dependent and originated, although it's independent, empty of or absence of any independent existence. So with the understanding of emptiness actually helps us to generate or develop the determination to be free from samsara, and also to reach liberation, enlightenment, Buddhahood. And therefore, we also have we can develop our sense of taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So Dharma here refers mainly to the comprise of the two truths, which are the true cessation and the true path. So when you understand the Dharma well, then you will also understand what the teacher is also like. And then also Sangha, you will understand. And so one Tibetan Indian master has said that I do not hold the Buddha to be supreme, nor do I have Kapila, the master, non-Buddhist masters, Kapila and so forth, but whoever has who's ever teaching is reasonable, and I follow that. And so we have to use our mind, this intellect, and understand the teaching of the Buddha, and not merely remain in blind faith. And so with regard to the teaching of emptiness, Master Nagarjuna has said, okay, it doesn't matter, I don't remember the words or the lines. So things that arise through causes and conditions are said to are said to be non-real. So, what is the purpose of realizing emptiness? It is to actually overcome our negative emotions, the destructive emotions. Earlier, when we were doing the monks and nuns confession ceremony, so this line actually refers to the teaching of the Buddha. There's a prayer that Chinese have. May we be able to dispel all negative emotion, the three poisons, and may we develop the light of wisdom. And so, the antidote or the counterforce to the three poisons is not just prayer. We cannot do some ritual, say these three poisons pacify, may they go away, and so forth. But we need to develop the experience within ourselves of and develop the wisdom, realizing emptiness. So, introduction of Buddhism should be done on the basis of the Four Noble Truths, which in turn are based on the understanding of the dependent origination of things. And so that also is the basis of the understanding of causality as well. So on the basis of understanding of causality and dependent origination of things, we can develop the wish to be free from samsara, as well as develop this aspiration to free others from suffering. To reach Buddhahood as well. So it's very important to study Buddhism and gain understanding of the teaching. So this is from my own personal experience, I find this to be when we engage in the in learning, reflecting on the teaching, and meditating, understand emptiness, to really understand the teaching of the Buddha. I do not claim this, but I feel close to so understand the path of all the Buddhas for reaching mere liberation. The emptiness is necessary. And so it is the sole door to liberation. And in order to put the teaching of the Buddha, having done this introduction, how to go about with the practice, we'll go through the Jataka. So the 30th chapter was finished up to yesterday. And then the next 31 is a chapter on this prince named Moon. So this is a story about the prince who overcame an evil being with great courage. And so it says in the story, even a chance meeting with a virtuous person promotes well-being. For this reason alone, those who long for awareness and balance in their lives should seek out the virtuous. So if we look at children, for example, they're very innocent and very open and honest. So they do not make any kind of discriminate each other on the basis of whether they belong to a well-off family or on the basis of religion or non-believers and so forth. But they have this sense of being humans. But as we grow up, this basic humanity that we are part of, we kind of, it becomes more and more vague in our life. Now, when education is considered important, of course, existing modern education system does not take that into account. That of the practice of compassion, the need for love and compassion, and therefore continuous problems, and especially when problems are created in the name of religion. We may say when this happens, but there are people who are taking interest and initiative to teach good human values in educational field, in the schools. So since modern education is mostly focused on material development alone, people who have people who are grown up, who have grown up in such an atmosphere, and therefore their way of life is more or less similar to the animals who only rely on their five senses more than the mind. And then they indulge in all kinds of negative emotions, attachment or lust and anger or hatred. And people are considered very efficient if they are able to show these emotions more and to get by in their life. But we need to actually take examples of look up on the people who are more compassionate, loving towards others. And therefore it says we should seek out the virtuous in this text. And once the Bodhisattva was born into the illustrious royal family of Kauravas. So the Buddha was born as a Bodhisattva, and when he was a Bodhisattva in a family of Kauravas, into a dynasty known to the world over for its glory. So because the Bodhisattva was very kind to others, it is said in the text that it was a family held in deep affection by the people. Even their proud neighbors had become their vassals, partly because of the sheer splendor of the Kauravas' power, but also because of the purity of the family's intentions. Because of the Bodhisattva's because the Bodhisattva was blessed with a face that reflected his hundreds of virtues. He was named Sutta Soma, lovely as the moon. And like the moon in the bright half of the month, his glory and grace increased every day. Having attained supreme knowledge of the sacred texts as well as a thorough understanding of the worldly arts and sciences, he became to be known as the kinsman of virtue, and as such was esteemed and loved by all the people. Indeed, he had become the greatest partisan of virtue. His regard for virtues ever increasing, his preservation of virtues assured by self-restraint. So he showed restraint to non-virtuous actions, because he was not overcome with greed or attachment and hatred. This was possible. And then through your learning of the 5 sciences and other subjects, one could also increase one's knowledge. His virtue, like the 16 phases of the moon, were his many aspects: good conduct and learning, charity and compassion. And so he was compassionate towards others who were suffering. Now here, the compassion has to be understood to be that compassion which actually wishes others to actually save others from suffering. And then he also had humility and clarity, forbearance and wisdom and firmness, love, modesty. Love here refers to wishing others to be happy, to have happiness. And modesty, civility and purity, strength, self-control and pureness of mind. All these are and more proliferated within his being. The loftiness of his personality, his high aspirations, and the greatness of his nature were further embellished by his youth. All these reasons and more, his father, the king, judged him capable of ruling the people, and so designated him heir apparent. So this prince was with all these great qualities, apart from being having all the qualities that were mentioned earlier. Fond of learning as he was, the prince particularly enjoyed hearing spiritual ideas aptly expressed, and indeed he paid quite a princely sum to hear those who could recite such maxims. So I will stop here, the story, and we'll do the ceremony for altruistic motivation, bodhicitta. So with generating bodhicitta, of course, all of us are equipped with altruism, love, compassion. So if you have love, then you will have happiness and then physical health as well. And then you'll have friends. So such a person, wherever he or she is, the atmosphere around him or her also will be peaceful, serene, and therefore to increase this quality of love and affection, it would be beneficial for ourselves and others. Now, regard to the kind of altruism that we are talking about here, we should think of liberating all sentient beings from suffering and its causes. So in the Sanskrit tradition or Buddhist scripture, there is mention of bodhisattvas who, with their wisdom on enlightenment, Buddhahood, so we should develop this sense of affection towards all sentient beings within the context of the Mahayana Buddhism. Usually, we become attached to those who are kind and good to us. We hate or even become angry towards those who actually harm us. But because we should understand that all sentient beings want happiness and suffering, just as oneself, and therefore, this kind of compassion that we are talking about here should is something that we should develop through learning and training. So have this intention to lead all sentient beings to omniscient state of Buddhahood. And that also by leading them to the understanding of emptiness, which will help in eliminating all negative emotions. And with that understanding, you also can eliminate all negative emotions from within your mind streams. And then that in turn, coupled with the bodhicitta, will lead you to, which thinks of liberating all leading all sentient beings to omniscient state. You should develop this bodhicitta. So in order to help sentient beings, when you intend to become a Buddha, that is the altruistic intention of, or the spirit of enlightenment, bodhicitta. So even if you have a very, if you are reach the tip of the experience of this kind of altruism, then you will feel that you will feel greatly satisfied, and therefore Shantideva says, finding this bodhicitta within oneself is like finding a treasure by a blind person in the garbage. So Shantideva says, it is the supreme elixir that overcomes the lord of death. It is an inexhaustible treasure that eliminates all poverty in the world's diseases. It is the evergreen tree that shelters all beings wandering tired on the roads of life. From wretched lives, it is the rising moon of mind that dispels the torment of addiction, and the sun that burns the ignorance of mighty ignorance of the world, and quintessential butter from the churning of the milk of Dharma. And so, if you want to be happy yourself, you should be compassionate towards others. To have a good life yourself, you should have, and friends and so forth. Whether you want happiness in this life or should. Understanding of emptiness actually should help you to develop bodhicitta as well. Therefore, bodhicitta and the understanding of emptiness are indispensable if you wish to reach Buddhahood. Bodhicitta is the root of all the method aspects of the practice, and understanding of emptiness, the root of all the wisdom aspect of the practice of bodhisattvas. So the Buddha, in his supreme emanation, Shakyamuni Buddha appeared in the world and this supreme emanation also must emanate, come from some body, physical dimension of all the complete enjoyment, and that in turn should arise from and so one should here imagine the Shakyamuni Buddha and also great arhats, and also Indian master and so forth. Each masters of the profound wisdom, extensive path. And in front of these, with these great beings in your visualization, let us say this prayer of the seven limb. This is making prostration and making offerings to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and then also and eats negative and sin. All things, and requesting the Buddhas not to pass away, and requesting the Buddhas to turn the wheel of Dharma or give teachings, and then you from prostration and so forth for the purpose of attaining Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. And that you can share the so through the seven limbs, what we have done is the practice of purification of negativities and accumulating merit. Let's say the verse of taking refuge, verse of refuge and bodhicitta, with which we will do ceremony for bodhicitta. So the objects of refuge for us here are the Buddha, who is the teacher. And then the actual refuge is the Dharma. Not the Buddha nor the Sangha are our actual refuge, which means who actually save us from this suffering and its causes, but the Dharma, because through the practice of the Dharma, what we do is we engage in practices whereby we refrain from negative actions and accumulate or cultivate the virtues within ourselves. And as they increase further and further, then we reach the point of cessation and liberation. And that kind of attainment also comes through the path that we should cultivate. And therefore, these two, the cessation and the true path, are what actually make up the true the Dharma. And so once you are you embody these two, the true cessation and true within yourself, you become a sangha. And here in the verse, we say, I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Supreme Assembly. And Supreme Assembly refers particularly, is a reference to the Bodhisattva Sangha. And so those who are on the Bodhisattva grounds, the 10 grounds, until you reach in the street, the Buddha. So your refuge, the practice of refuge, is the practice of refuge from the Mahayana of taking refuge, which means that you are taking refuge in order to become a Buddha for the benefit. And then, in this verse, you will come across the practices of generosity and so forth that may, through the practice of generosity and so forth, that I have done, may I become a Buddha. And so you come across this word I. So one should not think of selfish motive, with selfish motive, but when you think of others, more than oneself, what actually happens is, when you dedicate yourself for the welfare of others, with this bodhicitta, this spirit of enlightenment, then it will lead you to higher rebirth as well, and avert you from being reborn in lower realms of existence, prevent you from the lower realms of existence, and lead you to the state of deathlessness, with all kinds of negative emotions that actually ensue from selfish motive, such as anger and so forth, and then harming others. What they lead to through such actions is the lower realms of existence. And Shantideva has said that whatever happiness or goodness there is in the world comes from helping others, wishing others to have happiness, and whatever happiness there is in the world comes from wishing others to be happy, and whatever bad things there are comes from harming others. So of course there is great difficulty in us to increase this wish or the altruism towards others. But we should put effort and work hard on it. And therefore, to inspire us to develop and cultivate bodhicitta, Shantideva, Master Shantideva says, which intelligent person would feel despaired to ride the horse of bodhicitta, which leads one from bliss to bliss. And therefore, we have this opportunity today to actually engage in such a practice and such path. And therefore, however much hardship we may face, we should do our best to engage in these practices, and from life after life as well, and make such prayers as Shantideva says, as long as space remains, as long as all the miseries of the world. So if we could actually dedicate ourselves for the well-being of others, to bring about happiness and well-being of others until the end of space. We would have such an, there's no greater practice of protecting oneself. So if you meditate and cultivate bodhicitta, there's no greater cause cause for one's own happiness and others. So this will protect us from harms, and bring us real happiness, well-being. So if you have bodhicitta, then you'll be able to fulfill your goals, the temporary as well as the long or lasting ones. So we have actually come across the teaching of the Buddha, and we have the opportunity for doing the practices accordingly. Therefore, we should use this time that we have now, the opportunity, to actually dedicate ourselves for the well-being of others. Whatever good virtue we create from with our body or our speech, and also practicing six perfections and so forth. We should not think only to benefit oneself alone, but all sentient beings who are limitless or innumerable. So just as it is said in this verse, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings through my practice of generosity and so forth. So in order to help other sentient beings, you should motivate yourself to actually attain the omniscience. So in Buddhahood, what you attain are the twofold bodies. The physical body of a Buddha, which is meant for others, and then the Dhammakaya, which is meant for oneself. As Master Nagarjuna makes this prayer, may I complete the two collections of merit and wisdom and attain the two bodies of a Buddha. And then, in order to attain that, we need to develop the two paths, the wisdom and method. And these two are also based on the understanding of the two truths, the conventional truth and ultimate truth. And therefore, all the teachings of the Buddha are said to be based on these two truths. Master Nagarjuna says that in his Ratnavali or Jewel Garland. And so in this verse that you will repeat, you come across the word I in the Tibetan 2 times. First, you say to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, I take refuge until enlightenment. And then in the third line also, whatever practices of generosity and so forth I have done, and you come across this word. And so when you come across this word, what you have to think about it is that this I, of course, because of ego grasping, we actually cause ourselves more pain. And therefore, you should think that this I, the ego grasping holds on to, is not there. It is the source of problem for oneself and others as well. And then when you come across the word, for example, when you say, may I be blessed, you should also think that this is merely nominal. So when you come across the word I in this verse, you should think that I do not exist the way it appears to me, to my mind, but that it is merely designated. I'm merely designated and in name, merely in name. And so with this understanding, this time while you have found the human life and met with the Dharma, Buddha Dharma, and have this opportunity to practice on this day, the full moon day of the first month, let us verse after me. So if you have bad knees or bad legs, you can sit down. Doesn't matter, but please repeat these to the Buddha, Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. I take refuge until enlightenment is reached. All that I've done, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So please repeat it for the second time. As I have explained about the refuge, you take refuge. The Buddha as the teacher, Dharma, and then the Sangha who are on the Sattva grounds. So, how do you take refuge in them? So, just as the Buddhas and the Sangha that we visualize in front of us in the space have reached those grounds and the attainments, likewise, you also wish to become like them, a Sangha in first and then ultimately Buddha. And so, taking them as the causal refuge, you intend to reach the resultant refuge, that is yourself as the Sangha and yourself as ultimately a Buddha. So repeat this to the Buddha, Dharma, and Supreme Assembly. I take refuge until enlightenment is reached. Through the practice of generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Now at the third repetition, when you say, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings, think of becoming a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings. It's bodhicitta, in other words. And so every day you can recite this verse 10 or 100 or 1,000 times, and on a daily basis just reflect on bodhicitta, the qualities of bodhicitta. And so, and then at the end of this third repetition, think that you have actually generated or received this bodhicitta. To the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until enlightenment is reached. Through the practice of generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May bodhicitta, the supreme jewel of bodhicitta, grow where it is not grown yet. May it, without decline, may it grow further. And as long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain, may I too remain to dispel the misery of the world. So please sit down. Of the Buddha, we have met on this day of the full moon day of the first month, Tibetan month. So just as we rely on food and drinks for our sustenance, survival, in order to reach Buddhahood, we need to rely on the sustenance of the understanding of and emptiness and bodhicitta. Right in the morning, beginning of the day, when you wake up, recall the Buddha, and you can recite as soon as you wake up from your sleep. You can recite this verse. I pay homage to the Buddha, the Gautama, who out of his compassion has taught the holy Dharma to rid us of all distorted views. And so, imbued with the understanding of emptiness and bodhicitta in your mind stream, then if you do Deity Yoga practices, it will make really, the Deity Yoga practice will be effective. Otherwise, it will be like a parrot, without really understanding what the essence of Buddha Dharma is. The parrots can also recite Om Mani Padme Hum mantra. So, if a parrot can recite Om Mani Padme Hum, this mantra, would you say the parrot is a Buddhist? So, without really being inspired by the teaching of the Buddha, on a daily basis, if your mind is more or less preoccupied with making money, you may not consider yourself as a real Buddhist as such. But what you should do is make the teaching of the Buddha apply as the teaching of the Buddha to you, and also the teaching of the Mahayana applying to you as Mahayana teaching. So you should, in other words, what you should do is be practical about the teaching, not just give lip service. So those people who have come here from Tibet, as well as those who are inside Tibet now, and also for the Chinese people who are also taking interest in the Buddha Dharma, it would be good for us to recite Om Muni Muni Maha Munaya Swaha, the mantra of Shakyamuni Buddha. So if we could recite as a group here in this gathering, even once, it would make thousands. And if you could make it recite 10 times, it would multiply. So if you could recite this mantra of Shakyamuni, Om Mani Mahamuni Asoha, it would have great merit. You would have great merit from this recitation because of the auspicious day as well. And also, with regard to recitation of mantras, you could do recite Om Mani Padme Hum as well as Tara mantra, and also Guru Padmasambhava's mantra, and also the 7-line praise or prayer of Guru Padmasambhava, and also the praise of 21 Taras, and also the praise to the Buddha for teaching dependent origination. So how was the morning today? Did you get any blessing of the cold weather? This is now dedicating all the merits that we have gained through engaging in the discourse and also the bodhicitta ceremony, and so forth. 这些各位讲儿抗进行用松加钱，没有那么抗子别这上点点有都敲啊是，当中去年上面点点的敲什么都觉得 these are lines from the words of truth, which says that just as Chandra had Avalokiteshvara had made prayer to take the land of snow as his paradise, may all this as
Show